Is a peace deal between the US and Iran now completely off the table? The two sides have carried out strikes against each other for a second day in a row. We're going to be taking a closer look at that and more. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this DW live stream. We are live on YouTube and TikTok, so welcome to everyone who has joined us already. I can see there are some people with us already. I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts and questions. Let's start by taking a look at this. Now, these are US Navy Tomahawk missiles launched from a warship in the Gulf, fired at Iran for the second night in a row. Multiple targets were hit. That's according to the Pentagon. Now, Iran struck back at US bases in Bahrain, Kuwait and Jordan. So the ceasefire that was supposed to end this war, today it exists in name only, putting new pressure on those peace talks that so far haven't had any major results. Now, I'm going to be talking to Middle East analyst Fawaz Gerges about the significance of these US strikes on Iran and about Iran's response a bit later. I'm going to be bringing in Daniel Winter from DW Business. We're going to be talking about how people all around the world are being affected by what is happening in the Middle East. So again, let us know what you're thinking, how this war in the Middle East might be affecting you, your life. We'd love to hear from you. So let's start by bringing in Fawaz Gerges. I believe he is with us. There he is. Fawaz, great to see you. Fawaz is a professor of Middle Eastern politics and international relations at the London School of Economics. He's taught at Oxford, at Harvard, at Columbia Universities. He's an expert on relations between the Islamic and the Western worlds. So a really good person to speak to today. Fawaz, I'd like to start this conversation actually by listening to Pete Hegseth, so the US Secretary of Defense. He said this just before the US launched this second round of airstrikes on Iran into Thursday morning. Let's just take a listen.
They're choosing to play games. They're choosing to tap. If they want to tap, then the president will turn to the War Department. If we need to negotiate with bombs, we'll negotiate with bombs, and we're very good at it. Nobody better in the world. And again, so we're in lockstep with the White House, in lockstep with the negotiating team to make sure we set the conditions, and the targets tonight are meant to do that.
All right. So, Fawaz, is negotiating with bombs an effective strategy? Is this a strategy that makes sense at this stage in the war?
One of the lessons that we have learned in the past year is that despite overwhelming American and Israeli military power, this particular strategy has failed to force Iran to submit. It has failed to force Iran to accept President Trump's conditions. It's clear to everyone that Iran has its own national interest to defend. This is a failed strategy. And I think, if I may, really for our listeners and viewers, in terms of the big picture, it seems to me that what we have seen in the past 2 days is that the repeated clashes contradict President Trump's repeated reassurances to the American public and the world that a ceasefire peace deal between the United States and Iran is imminent.
That's right. I mean, he's been saying this for the last couple of months consistently, hasn't he? The peace deal is near. You know, they want a peace deal. This is happening, but it's not happening.
Anja, you know, one of the leading American television stations, the CNN, counted 38 times that the president has reassured Americans that the ceasefire was imminent, is imminent, 38 times. And what does this tell you? It tells you that President Trump is really desperate to get Iran to sign an agreement. And also it tells you that Iran has leverage, has influence. Iran thinks that time is in its favor. And that's why the fundamental deadlock in the past 2 months since the ceasefire, the so-called ceasefire, was declared, because the UN Secretary General said we have less of a ceasefire and more of a lesser fire. So really there is no ceasefire. We have a lesser fire between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran.
So Fawaz, you're talking about a US failed strategy, and you're saying that Trump is desperate. But, we're then hearing things from President Trump, and I'm quoting here, that Iran would have to pay the price for taking too long with the negotiations. So, given that you're saying this is just not working at all, do you see any chance left at all of a deal being made at this point?
Well, Anja, there is consensus among American strategists, not us, outside of the United States, that President Trump gravely miscalculated, that he finds himself in a strategic bind. He wants out, and I use the word desperate or desperately, not in a very light way. Just to give your viewers, again, to give our viewers a glimpse of what we're talking about. America's annual inflation rate was 2.4% before the war started in February. Just yesterday, according to the US federal government, America's annual inflation rate jumped from 2.4% to 4.3% in almost 3 months. So the pressure on the American households is extremely, extremely high. Americans are paying it. So that's why the president wants out, because he's a businessman. He understands the language of economics. And Americans, one of the lessons we have learned over the many years, care a great deal about their pocketbook. But to come to your other question about Iran, remember, Iran has not won. Iran has basically is hurting a great deal in terms of, you have a blockade of Iran's ports, hardly any goods coming into Iran. Most of its military infrastructure has been either damaged or destroyed. But Iran's capacity to absorb pain, it's much, much higher than the United States and the world economy. And that's why when we say that this strategy has failed, the strategy of military and economic pressure on Iran has failed. And that's why the president keeps saying, trying to increase the cost to Iran. It has not delivered. And he's using the same old failed strategy time and again against Iran.
We're going to talk about Iran and Iran's response just in a little while, but I wanted to ask you about the fact, or what you read into the fact, that the US announced these strikes in advance. What does that tell us? Because normally you wouldn't tell the enemy what you're about to do. Where are they coming from there?
I think this is very important because President Trump telegraphed America's intentions to Iran. So what we are seeing, to come back to the big picture, we're seeing controlled escalation, managed escalation. Even though Trump is escalating the attacks against Iran, he does not really want to renew all-out hostilities against Iran. The same way, Iran is also engaged in controlled escalation. Think, Iran attacked American military bases and infrastructure in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. Iran did not attack the United Arab Emirates. It did not attack Qatar. It did not attack Saudi Arabia. And this tells you that both sides, even though there is a fundamental deadlock between the two sides, both sides do not really want to go back to all-out hostilities, to all-out war, and they're engaged in controlled escalation, even though this controlled escalation could easily spiral out of control, because we have seen repeated clashes between the United States and Israel on the one hand, and Iran and its local allies on the other hand.
We're talking about this word control. It's being reported that the US strikes hit water storage buildings, with water then being cut off to more than 20,000 people living nearby. That's Iranian state media that are reporting that. US Central Command, is denying that, was essentially saying, it conducted attacks with precise munitions from US Air Force and Navy fighter jets. But what can you say about, allegations that the US might have hit civilian infrastructure and where that might lead?
Well, again, if we listen to President Trump has repeatedly threatened to destroy Iran's civilian infrastructure in terms of water, in terms of electricity, in terms of bridges. The United States and Israel repeatedly attacked Iran's civilian infrastructure, petrochemicals, universities, oil facilities, bridges, train stations. And according to the New York Times, one of the leading American newspapers today, the New York Times verified that American attacks hit a water station in Iran, and basically water was cut to almost 20,000 Iranians for almost 12 hours. And we need to take into account for our viewers, the temperature in Iran was almost 100 degrees.
Right. Yeah.
So this is, in a way, and again, at the beginning of the war, the American military killed more than 100 Iranian children. And even though it denied this at the beginning, the New York Times and other American newspapers verified that the American attacks killed more than 100, school children in Iran, mainly girls and boys.
So the idea of controlled strikes and controlled escalation, I mean, that you can't control it, is what you're saying.
Oh, absolutely. Because not only you can control, escalation because of miscalculation, because, both sides could really misread one another. And also, I think what we need to tell our viewers is that there is really no ceasefire. There is more of a lesser fire and escalation, not just between the United States and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz. Escalation, strategic escalation by Israel in Lebanon could also trigger all-out war. So for so far, limited, controlled, managed escalation, but the ceasefire or the lesser fire is very precarious, very fragile, and any kind of really spark could trigger all-out war between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other.
Fawaz, I just wanted to bring in, we've got comments starting to come in, and I just wanted to read you one comment by Performanta Sangstifter, who's saying the Iranians are only willing to make unacceptable deals. They need to be forced. What would your comment be to an opinion like that?
Well, I think that's exactly what President Trump believes. And that's exactly what the, Secretary of War or Defense believes. But this is a failed strategy. The United States and Israel have attacked Iran twice, last June and now. Think of how much really military power has been dropped on Iran in the past 1 year. American power, this is the most powerful military in the world. I think what I would like to tell our viewer is that military power on its own, particularly air power, cannot force a nation like Iran, a determined nation, a nation that believes that its very existence is at stake. So the Iranians are fighting from their point of view for their survival. This is an existential war. And that's why, in fact, despite all the military might of the United States and Israel, what we have seen in the past few months, Iran is more resilient, Iran is more emboldened, Iran is less cautious, Iran is less risk averse now. And that's why, in fact, the American and Israeli wars against Iran have produced the opposite results from their intended consequences. So for our good viewer, don't rely mainly on military power, because military power on its own cannot deliver strategic political objectives unless the United States basically try to not only ground attack and invade and occupy Iran as it did in 2003 in Iraq.
Iran is, however, coming back with pretty forceful language. I mean, it's being reported that an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander has threatened to, quote, turn the entire region into hell if the US destabilizes the Strait of Hormuz. So, again, Iran's position at this point is, you're saying, from a strong, it's much stronger than it was a few months ago, and it feels much stronger.
Well, I think, Anja, we need to distinguish between bluster and threats and reality. When I say that Trump's and Netanyahu's strategy has failed, does not really mean that Iran has won. Iran has limited military capacity, as we know. Iran is not even a middle power. It's a poor country, relatively speaking. It has been under some of the most severe sanctions in world history. Iran is hurting, Iran is paining. But you see, in asymmetrical warfare, as we are seeing between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran, nations like Iran, which are determined, which really was very resilient and dynamic and with stamina, could really resist for a long time. So we're talking about resistance. We're talking about resilience. We're not really talking about Iran's military capacity to attack either Europe or the United States or even inflict a great deal of damage on its adversaries. Its military capacity is limited. And what we hear from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard is mainly bluster, similar to what President Trump has been doing in the past few months vis-a-vis Iran.
Okay, let's talk about the Gulf nations, Fawaz. I mean, as we've been reporting, Iran's retaliatory strikes hit Bahrain, Kuwait and Jordan. You mentioned that earlier. What does this mean for them? I mean, have they reached a point now where they really have to figure out how are we going to deal with this situation? Because it's obviously not going away anytime soon.
No, I think, Anja, one of the most fascinating lessons we have learned is that what Iran is trying to do is to really drive a wedge within the Gulf Cooperation Council and also between the Gulf states and their main key strategic ally, the United States. What we have seen in the past few weeks is that Iran has stopped attacking the key nations in the Gulf, and that's Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. And I think the reason why, because Qatar and Saudi Arabia are engaged in a political, diplomatic rapprochement with Iran. We have seen major signs that the Saudis and the Qataris are really trying to, they have engaged Iran. So far, I mean, I am myself pleasantly surprised that Iran has not expanded its attacks in a blanket way as it did after the 28th of February. And this is why it wants to increase the cost for the United States, because remember, Kuwait and Bahrain and Jordan rely a great deal on America's military umbrella and also on America's political support. But it seems to me that Iran now is more careful and more cautious when it comes to the Gulf state. It does not really want to turn the entire Gulf Cooperation Council, the 6 states, against its strategy. But we have to wait and see. My take on it, a final point on your question, if we see renewal of all-out hostilities between the United States and Iran, I expect Iran to attack all the Gulf states, with the exception of Oman. This was Iran's strategy at the beginning of the American-Israeli war on the 28th of February.
Which brings me to a question from one of our viewers, Fawaz. Tired5429 is asking, why has no other country sent a legitimate convoy to the area to deter both American and Iranian attacks? So I guess a question about the wider international community and what is being done there. Can you talk to us about that for a second?
Well, I think the European Union and Japan and South Korea have made it very clear they won't take sides in this illegal war. Even Germany and France, even the United Kingdom, where I am, the closest American ally. Historically, we used to say, wherever the United States goes, the United Kingdom follows. But the British Prime Minister Starmer, which is really first, says, no, this is an illegal war. This is a war of choice. So even though Europe, including Germany and the UK and France and Italy, are preparing a naval force to basically help open the Strait of Hormuz, but only once hostilities end, only when the war ends. because they do not really want to take sides in this, in their view, in this illegal war. They believe this is a futile war. This is really was a personalized war carried out by Donald Trump and Netanyahu. So I don't expect either the European Union or even the international community to basically send any naval force to open the Strait of Hormuz, because they become parties to the hostilities between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran. And I think this has been a consistent position on the part of all NATO groups. I mean, every single nation. The United States, Donald Trump, has not found a single European nation or an international nation that's willing to join his war of choice against Iran.
Fawaz, whatever one's position is on this conflict, the fact that it has such a massive effect, a ripple effect on people all around the world is obviously very clear. And a lot of that is because of what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz. So just as a final question, I just wanted to talk about the situation there. Iran is saying that the Strait of Hormuz was completely closed to all types of vessel now, but the US is saying that commercial ships are continuing to transit in and out of the strait. Can you bring us up to date on what is happening there and what the broader effects are of that right now?
Well, you know, I'm glad you asked this question, because American strategy in the past few weeks, after it basically decided to blockade Iran's ports, has been to help vessels and ships basically transport through the Strait of Hormuz. And so far in the past few weeks, the American Navy has been able to basically get about 100 vessels out of the Strait of Hormuz. And again, one piece of information that we have learned in the past 24 hours, the reason why the helicopter, the Apache helicopter, was downed by Iran, because it was involved in helping foreign vessels to basically go through the Strait of Hormuz, and it was shot by Iran. But at the end of the day, 100 vessels are nothing. You're talking about a month, 3,000 vessels used to really go through the Strait of Hormuz, every single month. And now you're talking about 100 vessels in a month or so. But what American strategy has been, I mean, the broader American strategy is to try to erode Iran's blockade of the Gulf and tighten its noose. It's America's naval blockade of Iran's ports. And this is why gain strategic advantage on the negotiating table. So again, if we really want to understand the repeated clashes between Iran and the United States, we have to understand American strategy and the clashes over the Strait of Hormuz, because the American Navy has been trying to escort vessels through the Strait of Hormuz against Iran's wishes, and now we know it has failed, because President Trump yesterday telegraphed to the world what the Iranian Navy has been trying to do. But at the end of the day, the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, is shut down, is basically hardly any ships or vessel transports or goes through the Strait of Hormuz at this particular moment. And that's why the impact, the world economy, I mean, we're talking about not just inflation in the United States, inflation throughout Europe. You're talking about tens of millions of people in the developing world that have fallen to poverty, abject poverty, food insecurity. And not to mention, if this crisis continues, as it seems to be, according to the IMF and the World Bank, the world could really witness an economic recession. I mean, think where you are in Germany, how much the economic impact of the Strait of Hormuz, almost a third of oil and gas and fertilizers used to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and now almost zero, oil and gas and fertilizers.
Yeah. So fascinating to speak to you, Fawaz. Fawaz Gerges, Professor of Middle Eastern Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics. Great to get your analysis, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So just to remind everyone who is watching, here's a quick recap of the latest from the situation in the Middle East. The US and Iran have launched attacks on each other for a second night. The US is saying it launched missiles from a warship near Iran, and Iranian state media are reporting that there were explosions near the port of Bandar Abbas and near Karaj. Now, what you're seeing on screen now is a video posted on social media. It's showing a black plume of smoke seen near Karaj in northern Iran, filmed from a car. Now, Iran has responded by firing on US bases in the region, in Jordan, Kuwait and Bahrain, as we were just mentioning. Now, those missiles were intercepted. We've got some video from Bahrain here showing damaged buildings and vehicles in the kingdom as a result of the debris from downed Iranian missiles. Now, as we have been talking about, and as Daniel Winter, my colleague, and I are going to be talking about the effects of this conflict, of the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz on the price of oil, on how much people are paying for energy, on the price of fertilizer. All of this is really making itself felt around the world. So Daniel and I are going to be talking about that. But a reminder to you all, because again, we are live on YouTube and TikTok. Any questions you have, any comments, do let us know so we can bring them into our discussions here in the studio. So, Daniel, we've got to start by talking about oil. Oil prices have been in the headlines, haven't they, since the US and Israel started the war on Iran. Can you just give us a bit of an update on how the price of oil is, reacting to this latest escalation that we're seeing, and what that means?
Yeah, well, just to build on what Fawaz was saying there, Anja, I mean, this war is unprecedented, not in the fact that there is a direct conflict between the US and Iran. There was in 1988, in 2020, there were missiles fired as well, but in the scale and scope of what is happening. Yet oil prices are high, but nowhere near as high as we might expect them to be, considering the scale and scope of the conflict as it is at the moment. So, just in the past 15 minutes or so, Brent has just dropped below $93. That's one of the measures of the oil prices right now. And that's because of the latest flare-up that we've seen. And it's been a roller coaster ride over the past few months for oil prices as each strike has came, and then they collapsed again in May because, it looked like peace could break out. Now they're ratcheting up once again with each step in the conflict. The big mystery is, though, why aren't we at $200 a barrel of oil? And what it looks like is happening, according to the analysts at JP Morgan, for example, is that about 2.1 million barrels a day are leaking out of the Strait of Hormuz. They are sneaking out of there somehow. Transponders are being switched off on boats, for example. They're dodging the blockade that is taking place there. And it's only because of this that there is some sort of cushion against a massive price rise because of what's happening.
That's really interesting. So that is something so people are being pretty clever about this, and that is something that will continue, presumably, to kind of keep a cap on this situation, as you say, not for it not to go even crazier. I
mean, they call it black gold for a reason, right? It is that valuable that people are looking for ways to be able to get as much as they can out of the Strait of Hormuz, avoiding any of these blockades that are occurring. But still, even at $93 and the potential to go higher if the conflict escalates even further, this is having an impact on people at the petrol pump. It is impacting the cost of heating and eating for people all around the world. And I think what really people are considering is the fact that the livelihoods of millions of people in the world, in fact, in some sort of way, it touches billions of people in the world. And at the very margins, the very, very margins, it can affect the survival of certain people. And we'll talk about that more in a moment, I'm sure. And all of this depends on Trump, on Netanyahu and Khamenei coming together and agreeing on stopping the war. And at the moment, that is not happening. And many, many people are affected by this directly or indirectly.
Yeah, and as you're saying, I mean, survival. I wanted to actually show our viewers a post on X by the United Nations chief, Antonio Guterres. If I think we can just pull that up. He wrote that the restrictions on navigational rights and freedoms in and around the Strait of Hormuz are causing hardship and instability across the world. even in the best case scenario, these shocks will be felt for many months, with developing countries bearing the heaviest impacts. The world needs a complete ceasefire with navigational rights and freedoms restored in line with international law. So, Daniel, that's the United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres just underlining just how huge these impacts are. Can you tell us, go into more detail about how people around the globe are feeling the effects, you know, how everyday lives are not only being affected, but are being threatened in some cases?
Well, the fact that Guterres has intervened, he doesn't intervene over anything. It goes to show that this is truly a global story. What started off in the Middle East is affecting people in their daily lives around the world. I mean, we've seen, for example, panic buying, fuel shortages in countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. Families in India are struggling to get cooking gas cylinders, for example. And everywhere, the price of everyday goods has been pushed up. Even the US is not immune from this, because recently inflation there's been pushed up above 4%. And Donald Trump has said he loves inflation. I have a feeling that voters may disagree. I mean, we know it's been the case for centuries that voters have always looked to the economy and their daily living circumstances.
I mean, we'll see what happens in the midterms in November, won't we?
Absolutely.
How people react.
Absolutely, and this was something that the Obama administration knew, because they were the ones who orchestrated a whole raft of sanctions against Iran, and they were very, very careful to not press too hard and therefore impact the oil markets and therefore impact Americans' daily lives. And Trump has torn up that rule book with what he's doing now. But just to dig a little bit deeper into Guterres' point about poorer countries, their currencies are weakening, their borrowing costs are rising, and the UN says that 3.4 billion people live in countries which are spending more on servicing their debts than they are on health and education. And so the same type of shock, which for us in Berlin is an annoyance, and it does affect people here. For people in Dhaka, for example, it is a crisis.
Yeah. Let's talk about fertilizer, because this is a really, really big issue that I don't think is talked about enough. Now, basically, before the start of the war, about 30% of global fertilizer supplies were flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this has left poorer nations particularly exposed, hasn't it? Tell us more about how vital fertilizer supplies are, and again, the effects around the world, but particularly for poorer nations.
Yeah, people think petrochemicals and they think, why should I care? It's actually massively important, because a third of seaborne fertilizer supplies came from the Strait of Hormuz pre-war. And if you look at the workhorse of fertilizers, urea, for example, the price of that has jumped 50% to $700 a tonne. And
it's jumped 50%, you said?
It's jumped 50% to over $700 a tonne.
Okay.
And why should you care? Because today's fertilizer is tomorrow's food. And you might even not be able to detect the price rises now. I mean, there are early price rises for food and the kind of agricultural goods, but that will increase further down the line as harvest comes, 6 to 9 months after the initial shock. That is when we will really start to see an effect on the likes of farmers in Brazil and India, across Africa, who can't just absorb that cost. Of course, they could say, we'll use less fertilizer, but that means that their yields are lower. That means that they can generate less money for their families, put less money into their local communities. The impact just ricochets all around these economies. And as a kind of useful comparison, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine is a major exporter of fertilizer. That affected about 15% of the global fertilizer supply. And at that time, food prices rose to generational highs in parts of the world. This crisis looks like it's choking off about twice that share of traded supply of fertilizer. So Guterres is right to point out that this is a global humanitarian issue and not just about the direct conflict between these countries.
So from talking about people all around the world, let's focus in on the people in Iran in particular. Now, we've been talking about the ceasefire. It's being on its last legs. People in Iran are now essentially having to worry again about their country being attacked. But talk to us about the challenges that they've been faced since the start of this conflict, the effect on their economy, rising food prices, food and medicine shortages. They're dealing with telecommunication restrictions. Talk to us about how they have been affected in particular.
Well, I want to start with those telecoms restrictions because they're a massive aspect. It's not just an emotional connection or being able to play your favorite video games or these kinds of things. It is about, maintaining your entire business, which people have built around the internet. It is about, people abroad who cannot contact their families in many cases to see how they're doing through this crisis. I mean, when I spoke to the professor of economics at Virginia Tech, Javad Salehi Isfahani, I asked him, naively, I must say, how is your family coping during this crisis? And he says, I don't know. I can't contact them to even give a word of comfort to them. And, of course, there are soaring prices, medicine shortages, as you mentioned, job losses, a deep recession. There was some talk, I remember reporting at the beginning of this particular crisis, well, the prices are rising, and so whatever exports Iran can do, it will be able to generate more money per barrel, and that will balance things out in the end. But, of course, the blockade has put paid to that, and prices aren't rising as much as Iran may be able to benefit from in some sort of way. So we're looking at, oil exports collapsing under the blockade. About $4.8 billion in revenue has been lost. This was by early May, so it'll be even more right now. And that means essentially that there is little cushion that can be provided for ordinary people in Iran to kind of counteract some of these effects that we're seeing. And so therefore, it is also in Iran a growing humanitarian crisis.
Just wanted to bring up a comment by somebody whose username is very difficult to pronounce. I'm going to give it a try. Dio Dated Eshmuk, 5494. I think I got that right. He is saying the deal is not dead, humanity is dead. Now, I'm hoping that that is not the case because, of course, there are many, many people who care very deeply about what is happening and want to find a solution to this, whatever the leaders are doing. It kind of leads me to my next question, which is how people are managing, the resilience that nations are showing, despite the challenges, despite being so heavily sort of reliant on imported Gulf oil, and yet they're finding ways around this. How are people working and countries working out ways to sort of reduce the impact and deal with this?
For some countries, it's too late. They didn't prepare ahead of this crisis. Some countries have managed to manage things quite on the button, actually. I mean, countries are draining their strategic reserves in order to balance out some of the effect. Parts of Southeast Asia have gone further with things like fuel rationing or asking people to work from home in order to reduce fuel use. When it comes to Japan, for example, they have 175 days worth of oil reserves. That's quite a good cushion for them. But India only has 10 days. So the impact is therefore affecting different countries differently as to how much they can absorb and protect their populations from the cost of oil prices rising. That's the major difficulty is, did you price in these changes in the oil price? Even airlines in Europe, some of them have managed to price in those changes ahead of time. They managed to hedge their bets and buy oil at a cheaper price and plan that in for the next year or longer. Airlines like Ryanair have not been as massively affected by this because they have that hedging process a long time in advance. And the same goes for countries as well. Have they managed to hedge their bets ahead of time? Have they managed to build up their strategic oil reserves? Now, if they want to do their best to protect their populations, it is extraordinarily difficult. And that's why you have the likes of India turning to Russia to try and get cheap oil from them. In the end, Russia is one of the winners of this war. That won't necessarily stop their economy from sinking further, but it is one of the major assets that they have to offer other countries abroad is a discounted price on oil. So in the end, this is having, this crisis is reaching its fingers into all parts of all economies and everybody's lives. And it would be a mistake to think that it is restricted to just Iran, the US and Israel, for example. And in the end, because of that effect, because the fact that it will take many months to recover, if the war stopped tomorrow, refilling all of those reserves and getting prices back to normal will take months. It is clear that there is going to be no winner in this war.
Another reason why all eyes are on that region and on President Trump and Iran to see if a deal can at some point be struck. Daniel Winter from DW Business, really great to talk to you. Thank you so much. And that does bring us to the end of this live stream. Thanks everyone so much for watching, for listening. We'll be back again soon. Thanks very much. Take care.